The police put me in handcuffs at 1:30 a.m., and my daughter-in-law stood behind them in the doorway, with fake tears running down her face, and my son looked at me over her shoulder and smirked. "You're under arrest for fraud," the young officer said, reading me my rights, and my daughter-in-law made a small broken sound and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Everett, we didn't have a choice. You left us no choice." While my son, my own son, stood there with the smallest, ugliest smile I have ever seen on a human face. And I said nothing. I did not resist. I did not protest my innocence. I did not tell them they were making a catastrophic mistake. I simply held out my wrists for the cuffs and let them walk me out of my own house in my bathrobe at 1:30 in the morning, past my son and his wife, who were, I understood perfectly well, the reason the police were there at all. And here is the thing you need to understand, the thing that makes this whole story what it is. I let them do it. I could have stopped it with a single sentence. I could have said 7 words that would have made those officers go pale and step back. But I didn't say them, because I wanted to see it. I wanted to watch my son and his wife walk all the way to the end of the road they'd chosen, with no idea whatsoever what was waiting for them there. They thought they were getting rid of a helpless old man. They had no idea who they had just called the police on. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and this story only makes sense if I tell it in order, so stay with me, because what happened at that police station and what happened the next morning at my son's house is something I promise you will not see coming. And if you've ever been betrayed by the people who should love you most, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had absolutely no idea what you were capable of, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this is a story about exactly that, and about what happens when the people who think they've trapped a helpless old man find out how wrong they were. Let me back up. My name is Everett Calloway. I'm 68 years old. And to everyone in my quiet life, my neighbors, the people at my church, and yes, my own son and his wife, I am nobody special. A retired old man in a modest house, living quietly on what they all assumed was a modest pension. Unremarkable, forgettable. The kind of harmless elderly man that a certain kind of person looks at and sees not a person but an opportunity. That picture of me is a lie. Not a lie I told with words, but a lie I let people believe, deliberately, for reasons I'll explain. Because the truth about who I am, and what I did for a living for nearly 40 years, is the entire hinge of this story, and it is the thing my daughter-in-law never bothered to find out before she decided to destroy me. I'll tell you the truth in a moment. First, you need to understand how I ended up in those handcuffs. Let me tell you about my son, Lucas, because he's the heart of the heartbreak, and I want to be honest about him even though it hurts. Lucas is 38 years old, my only child, and I have loved him every day of his life, including the day he smirked at me while I was arrested, and including today. But I'll tell you plainly, my son is a weak man. He was a sweet boy, but somewhere along the way he became a man who wanted the rewards of life without the work of it, who was always looking for the easy path, who was, and this is the fatal flaw, deeply susceptible to the will of a stronger, harder personality. And about 10 years ago, that stronger, harder personality walked into his life, and her name was Sierra Vane. She kept her own name, which I noticed, and Lucas didn't, and I want to be fair, so I'll say that Sierra was intelligent and charming and, when she wanted to be, warm. But underneath all of it, from very early on, I saw something in Sierra that gave me a cold feeling. A calculation, a hunger, a way of looking at people and at things and quietly assessing what they were worth to her. My late wife saw it too. My wife, Lucas's mother, God rest her, met Sierra exactly twice before she passed, and afterward she took my hand and said, "Everett, watch that girl. She's not what she pretends to be. She's going to be trouble for our boy." And my wife was right, as she was right about most things, and I've spent a great deal of time these past weeks wishing she were still here. My wife passed away about 4 years ago, and I'll tell you, losing her broke something in me that has never quite healed. We were married for a very long time, and she was the one person in the world who knew the whole truth about me, who I never had to pretend with, and when she was gone I was more alone than I have ever been. And that loneliness, that isolation, is part of why what happened next was able to happen. A widower, living alone, seemingly unremarkable, I was exactly the kind of target that a predator looks for. Now, let me tell you the truth about who I am. Because this is where the story turns. For nearly 40 years I was a federal agent, and then a federal official, and I finished my career as a director in a federal agency, a serious one whose entire purpose was investigating financial crime. Fraud, money laundering, identity theft, financial exploitation. For 4 decades, catching people who steal, who forge, who defraud, who prey on the vulnerable was not just my job, it was my life's work and my life's expertise. I ran major investigations. I built cases that put sophisticated criminals away for a very long time. I trained the people who train the people who do this work now. When it comes to financial fraud, I am, without exaggeration, one of the most experienced people you could ever meet. Let me give you a sense of it because it matters to what happened later. In my career, I took down fraud rings that had stolen hundreds of millions. I sat across interrogation tables from conmen so smooth they could sell you your own watch, and I took them apart, patiently, piece by piece, because I understood something they didn't, that every fraud, no matter how sophisticated, leaves a trail, and that the criminal's greatest weakness is always their own confidence. I specialized, in the back half of my career, in exactly the kind of crime that would later be committed against me: financial exploitation of the vulnerable, identity theft, forgery, the quiet robbery of people who trusted the wrong person. I testified before Congress on it. I wrote the guidance that field agents still use. When predators who prey on the elderly were the target, I was the man they sent. I have looked into the eyes of more financial predators than almost anyone alive, and I know exactly how they think, because understanding how they think was my job for 40 years. So when one of them moved into my own family and set her sights on me, she was, without knowing it, walking into the one house in America where her particular art was best understood. She thought she was robbing a mark. She was performing amateur theater in front of the world's least forgiving critic, and almost no one in my current life knew any of it. Why? For a few reasons. Part of it was operational habit. In the kind of sensitive federal work I'd done, you learn to keep a low profile, to not advertise who you are, and after 40 years that becomes who you are. Part of it was that after my wife died, I wanted peace. I wanted anonymity. I did not want to be the retired director. I wanted to be nobody, an ordinary old man tending his garden, because being ordinary felt like rest after a lifetime of being anything but. And part of it, honestly, was a lifetime instinct. You don't show people your cards. You let them reveal themselves first. It's how you catch them. So I lived quietly, modestly, and I let my son and his wife and everyone else believe I was an unremarkable old man of modest means. Sierra had no idea that the harmless father-in-law she looked at and saw as an easy mark had spent 40 years doing nothing but catching people exactly like her. That was her fatal mistake. Let me tell you what she did with it. And I want to name the mistake precisely, because it's the morale of the entire story. Sierra's error wasn't greed. Plenty of people are greedy. It wasn't even cruelty, though she had that in abundance. Her fatal error was contempt. The specific, arrogant contempt that let her look at a quiet old man and simply decide, without a shred of curiosity, that she had him fully understood. She never asked what I'd done for a living. She never wondered why a man might keep to himself. She never considered that quiet and modest and old might be covering something she couldn't see. She saw the surface and assumed it was the whole. And that is the mistake that predators make over and over, the mistake I spent 40 years watching them make. They are so certain of their own cleverness, so contemptuous of the people they prey on, that they never bother to find out who they're actually dealing with. Contempt makes you stupid. It closes your eyes. Sierra's contempt for the helpless old man was so total that she robbed, and then tried to destroy, one of the most experienced fraud investigators in the country, and never once suspected it, right up until the moment the handcuffs closed on her own wrists. It started slowly, the way these things do. After my wife died, Lucas and Sierra became more involved in my life, ostensibly out of concern for the grieving widower, and I was grateful for it at the time, grateful not to be so alone. Sierra was solicitous. She offered to help me with things. She offered to help me manage my finances, since I was getting older and it was all so complicated, wasn't it? And wouldn't it be easier to let her handle some of it? And I, in my grief and loneliness, let her help. I gave her more access than I should have. And here is where being who I am matters, because I want to be honest that even I, with all my expertise, was vulnerable, because grief and loneliness make fools of everyone. and because you don't expect it from your own family. For a while, I didn't see it, but old instincts don't fully sleep, and after a while I started to notice things. Small things at first. A statement that didn't quite add up. A transaction I didn't remember authorizing. A document with my signature on it that I was fairly sure I had never signed. And the 40-year investigator in me woke all the way up. I remember the exact moment it happened. I was at my kitchen table with a bank statement, one Sierra had helpfully been managing for me, and my reading glasses down my nose, and I was only half paying attention. And then a single line stopped me cold. A withdrawal I had not made. A transfer to somewhere I didn't recognize. And I felt something shift in my chest. A cold and familiar click, like a key turning in a lock I hadn't opened in years. It was the feeling I used to get across the table from a suspect when they told the one small lie that unraveled everything. The feeling of the pattern suddenly becoming visible. And I sat very still at that kitchen table, and I did not react, and I did not call anyone, and I did not confront anyone because 40 years of training took over in an instant. Instead, I got up, and I made myself a cup of coffee, and I sat back down, and I began, quietly, methodically, the way I'd done 1,000 times, to pull the thread. Within an hour I'd found 3 more. Within a week I understood the whole scheme, and the strangest part, I'll tell you honestly, was that underneath the heartbreak of what I was finding, my own son, my own daughter-in-law, robbing me, there was also this cold, clean, professional calm settling over me. The investigator taking the wheel from the grieving father. It was almost a relief in a terrible way. I knew how to do this. This I knew how to do. Because I know financial fraud the way a surgeon knows anatomy. And once I started really looking, quietly, carefully, giving no sign that I was looking, I saw the whole architecture of it, and it was breathtaking in its cruelty. Sierra, with my weak son either helping or looking the other way, had been systematically stealing from me. Draining accounts a little at a time, forging my signature, badly to my trained eye, but well enough to fool a busy bank clerk. Using my identity, my information, to move money and open things and reroute assets. They were robbing me blind, betting that the lonely, grieving old man would never notice, and if he did notice, would be too confused, or too frail, or too trusting to do anything about it. They picked the wrong old man. Now, here's the part that matters. The part that shows you the difference between a criminal and a professional. When most people discover they're being robbed by their family, they confront them. They rage, they cry, they demand it stop. And that accomplishes nothing except warning the criminal to cover their tracks. I did not do that. 40 years of building cases had taught me something better. You don't tip off the target. You gather evidence, quietly, completely, and then you bring in the proper authorities and you let the law do what the law does. So, that's what I did, quietly, over a period of weeks. I documented everything. I still knew how, better than almost anyone alive. And then I did the thing Sierra never imagined the helpless old man could do. I picked up the phone and I called former colleagues of mine, people still in federal law enforcement, people who knew exactly who I was and what my name meant. And I reported it. I laid out what I'd found, the identity theft, the forgery, the systematic fraud. And because of who I was, and because the evidence was solid, they took it seriously immediately. A case was opened, a real one, a federal one, with my son and daughter-in-law as the subjects and me as the reporting victim. Sierra had no idea. She thought she was still robbing a clueless old man. And I want to dwell on this for a moment, because it's the single most important decision in the whole story, and it's the one most people would get wrong. Everything in me, as a father, wanted to confront them. Wanted to stand in front of my son and his wife and say, "I know what you're doing, how could you? Stop it right now." That's the human instinct. The wounded, betrayed heart wants the confrontation, wants the tears and the reckoning. But 40 years had taught me that the human instinct is exactly wrong. Confrontation feels satisfying and accomplishes nothing but warning. The moment you tell a criminal you're onto them, they stop, they cover their tracks, they destroy evidence, they get their story straight, and they turn the tables. And suddenly it's your word against theirs, and the trail goes cold. The professional does the opposite of what feels good. The professional stays quiet, keeps a normal face, gathers everything, and brings in the authorities while the criminal is still comfortable and still making mistakes. It is the hardest discipline in the world, to sit across the dinner table from people robbing you and smile and say nothing while you build the case that will end them. But that discipline is exactly what 40 years had drilled into me, and it's exactly what Sierra, in her contempt for the helpless old man, never dreamed I possessed. She thought she was dealing with a victim. She was dealing with an investigator who had simply chosen not to tell her the game was already over. In fact, she was already the subject of a federal fraud investigation initiated by one of the most experienced fraud investigators in the country, who happened to be her own father-in-law. She just didn't know it yet. And then, apparently, she started to sense that I was onto her. Maybe I asked one question too many. Maybe a bank contacted me and she found out, and she panicked. And a panicking predator does something desperate. And what Sierra did was the single most catastrophic miscalculation I have ever seen a criminal make. She decided to get rid of me first, to discredit me, to neutralize me before I could expose her. And her method was breathtaking in its audacity. She would use the police against me. She fabricated a story that I was the one committing fraud, that I had defrauded her and Lucas, stolen from them, that I was a confused and dangerous old man who had turned on his loving family. She manufactured evidence to support it, poorly, again, to a trained eye, but convincingly enough for a late-night complaint. And she filed a report, and she pushed, and she played the frightened, victimized daughter-in-law so well that she got the police to come to my house at 1:30 in the morning to arrest me. She weaponized the police to remove the one man who had already reported her to the FBI. Do you understand the trap she walked into? She was so certain I was helpless that she called the very institution, law enforcement, that I had served for 40 years, and that was, at that very moment, already investigating her. She marched her victim, in handcuffs, directly into the one place on earth where the truth about both of us was already on file, which brings us back to that night and to what happened when they took me to the station. Let me take you there. 1:30 in the morning, my son smirking, my daughter-in-law weeping her crocodile tears, and me in handcuffs and a bathrobe, being put into the back of a police car. And as I said at the start, I let it happen. I did not say the words that would have stopped it, because I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted to watch them commit themselves completely, in front of witnesses, to their crime. Filing a false police report is itself a serious offense, and every second they let this continue, every lie they told those officers was another charge, another nail. So I stayed quiet, and I let my son and his wife dig their hole as deep as they wanted to dig it. I want to tell you what it actually felt like, standing in my own living room at 1:30 in the morning with the cuffs going on, because it was one of the strangest experiences of my life. There was the pain, of course, the almost unbearable pain of watching my own son smirk while strangers arrested me in my home. That was real, and it cut deep. But running alongside the pain, cool and steady, was the professional, watching everything, cataloging. I noticed which officer seemed uneasy and which was just going through the motions. I noticed the exact words Sierra used. We didn't have a choice. He left us no choice. And I filed them away, because they were the words of someone constructing a narrative, and narratives constructed under pressure fall apart under scrutiny. I noticed Lucas hanging back, not meeting my eyes, and I understood that my son's conscience wasn't fully dead, just fully overruled. And I noticed, with a kind of grim inner calm, that every single thing happening in that room was being witnessed by police officers who would later be witnesses, to Sierra's performance, to the false complaint, to all of it. Part of me stood in that living room in handcuffs and grieved, and part of me stood there and thought, with 40 years of cold clarity, keep talking, Sierra. Every word you say tonight is a word you'll answer for. So I held out my wrists, and I kept my face calm, and I let them take me because I understood something none of them did. That the person truly in control of that room was the old man in the handcuffs. They rode their own triumph all the way to the station. Sierra even came along, still playing the devastated victim, dabbing her eyes, telling the officers how hard this was for the family, how they'd tried everything before resorting to this. Lucas trailed behind her, and he wouldn't meet my eyes now. And I think some small part of my weak son was beginning to feel the first flicker of unease, though it was far too late for that. At the station, they began to process me, and a young officer sat down to enter my information, and he asked for my identification and I gave it to him, calm as still water. And he ran it. And I watched him freeze. I watched this young officer's face change as whatever came up on his screen registered. I watched him go very still, and then read it again, and then look up at me with an expression I knew well, because I had seen it on the faces of countless people over the years the moment they understood they were dealing with something far larger than they'd realized. It was the look of a man who has just discovered he is standing on the edge of a cliff he didn't know was there. Because here is what came up when he ran my identification. Two things, and either one alone would have stopped him cold, but together they were catastrophic. The first was who I was. My record flagged me immediately as a retired federal director, a senior former official of a federal law enforcement agency, with all the weight and protected status that carries. You do not casually process a decorated former federal director on a late-night fraud complaint from a family member. That alone made the young officer's stomach drop. But the second thing was the one that made him bolt out of his chair. Because my identification didn't just flag me as a former director. It flagged me as the reporting victim in an active, open federal fraud investigation. And the subjects of that investigation, the people under federal investigation for defrauding me, were Lucas Calloway and Sierra Vane. The two people who had just brought me here in handcuffs. The officer understood in an instant that everything was backwards. That the criminal they'd arrested was a former federal director. That the victims who'd filed the complaint were the actual subjects of a federal fraud case. That his department had been used as a weapon by two fraud suspects to try to neutralize the very man who had reported them. And that he was, at this moment, at the center of a catastrophe. He stood up so fast his chair scraped, and he leaned over and whispered to his supervising officer, and I watched that officer's face do the same thing his had done. And within about 10 minutes, the whole tenor of that police station had transformed. Because word moves fast when something like this surfaces. Phone calls were made. Higher-ranking officers appeared, first one, then several, converging on the room where I sat. Still in my bathrobe, still in handcuffs, calm as a Sunday morning. The mood went from routine late-night booking to something approaching crisis. These were serious professionals realizing that a serious mistake had been made, that a former federal director had been arrested on a false complaint by the subjects of an active federal case, and that this was going to require very careful handling. And I'll tell you, from my seat in that room, still in my bathrobe, still perfectly calm, watching it unfold was like watching a machine I'd helped build spring into motion. I knew every step of what was happening, because I'd been on the other side of it 100 times. I knew the young officer's stomach had dropped. I knew the calls that were being made, and to whom and why. I knew that somewhere a federal duty agent was being woken up and told a name that made them sit bolt upright in bed. I knew that the careful procedural dance of a serious law enforcement organization discovering it had been used as a weapon was now inevitable and unstoppable. And through all of it I simply sat, an old man in a robe, and waited, because there was nothing left for me to do. I'd set it all in motion weeks ago. Tonight was just the machinery catching up to what I already knew. One of the higher-ranking officers, passing me, paused and looked at me with something between apology and wonder, and I gave him a small nod, one professional to another, and I saw him understand that I wasn't afraid, had never been afraid, that I'd been exactly where I meant to be the entire time. And then the captain arrived, a man named Malik Rhodes, the senior officer on duty, and he came into that room and he looked at me, at this old man in a bathrobe and handcuffs, and I watched him put it all together, and I watched genuine mortification cross his face. And he crossed the room quickly, and he had the handcuffs removed from my wrists himself, and he said, "Director Calloway, sir, I am so deeply sorry." And then he said the thing I'll remember for the rest of my life. He looked at me, this decorated old man he'd found in his booking area, and he shook his head slowly, and he said quietly, "Sir, why didn't you tell them who you are? You could have stopped this at your front door. Why did you let them do this to you?" And I looked at Captain Rhodes and I told him the truth. I said, because I needed to see how far they were willing to go. I've spent 40 years learning that the best way to catch someone is to let them show you exactly who they are. If I'd stopped it at the door, it would have been my word against theirs. But this? And I gestured mildly at the handcuffs the captain had just removed, at the station around us. This they did to themselves, in front of all of you. They filed a false report. They committed a crime, tonight, on top of all the others with a dozen witnesses. I didn't need to tell them who I am. I needed to let them finish becoming who they are. And Captain Rhodes looked at me for a long moment, and then something like awe came into his face and he said, "You let them arrest you and to build the case. And I said, I let them arrest me because they were always going to, and the only question was whether they'd do it in a way that helped them or a way that ended them. I just made sure it was the second one. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because this is where it all came together, and this is the part you've been waiting for. Once my identity was confirmed and the situation understood, things moved very quickly, and they moved the way I knew they would, because I know exactly how this machinery works. I built a career on it. I was not going to spend that night or any night in a cell. The complaint against me was not just false. It was itself evidence of the crime already under investigation. Within a couple of hours, I had been fully released, treated with every courtesy, provided coffee and a chair and profound apologies. My former colleagues in the federal agency were contacted and confirmed everything, and the active investigation into Lucas and Sierra, which had been proceeding at the careful pace of federal cases, suddenly had a powerful accelerant. The subjects had just committed a brazen new crime, filing a false police report to weaponize local law enforcement against a federal witness. That is the kind of thing that makes a case catch fire. And here's what happened over the next few hours, and I want to be precise about it, because it matters that all of this was done properly, by the law, and not by me. I did not, could not, and would never simply order anything as a private citizen or even as a former official. That's not how it works, and any story that tells you a retired official can personally freeze someone's assets or command a raid is lying to you. But here is what the law can do, and did, when handed a case like this. The federal prosecutors handling the case, now armed with the false report incident on top of the existing fraud evidence, moved fast. A judge was presented with the evidence of the fraud, the identity theft, the forgery, the systematic theft from me, and now the fabricated complaint. And the judge did what judges do in serious fraud cases where stolen assets are at risk of disappearing. The judge issued an order to freeze the relevant assets, to preserve the money and property while the case proceeded, so that Sierra and Lucas couldn't liquidate and run. And warrants were issued, arrest warrants for Lucas Calloway and Sierra Vane on charges of fraud, identity theft, forgery, and filing a false police report. And because the investigation had flagged some of Sierra's associates, the people she was entangled with, some of whom had concerning histories, and because there was a real flight risk with significant money involved, the execution of those warrants was handled by a full tactical team, not 2 officers in a squad car. This was now a serious federal and local operation, executed by the actual authorities, with all the weight the law brings to bear on financial predators who weaponize the police against a federal witness. I did not order any of it. I simply reported a crime weeks ago to the right people, and then let my son and his wife commit the final, fatal crime that turned a careful investigation into an unstoppable one. The law did the rest. That's the whole point. I didn't need power over the system. I understood the system. There's a difference, and it's the difference between a vigilante and a professional. Now, the morning after. This is the part I think about most. Lucas and Sierra had apparently spent that night and the next morning celebrating. They genuinely believed they'd won. They'd gotten the old man arrested, out of the way, discredited. In their minds, the path was now clear. With me painted as a criminal, whatever I might later say about their theft would be dismissed as the ravings of a man who'd himself been arrested for fraud. They thought they were brilliant. I'm told there was champagne. And I'll be honest with you about where I was, emotionally, because it wasn't triumph. I was in a borrowed set of clothes at the federal building, having spent the night giving statements, and I was grieving. Because whatever was about to happen to Sierra was justice, but Lucas was my son, and no matter what he'd done, watching your child destroy himself is not a thing a father celebrates. I felt no joy. I felt a deep, weary sadness, and under it, a grim resolve that this had to be finished properly. When the authorities were ready to execute the warrants, I asked if I could be present, lawfully, at a proper distance with the officers. Partly because I needed to see it end with my own eyes, and partly, I'll admit, because after 40 years, some instinct in me needed to close the case in person. So I went home first, and I did something that felt strange and right at the same time. I took off the bathrobe and slippers version of myself, the harmless old man costume I'd worn for years, and I put on a suit. A real one, tailored from my other life, the life of Director Calloway. I looked at myself in the mirror, an old man who suddenly looked like exactly what he'd spent 40 years being, and I understood that the disguise was over. The quiet, forgettable retiree was a role I'd played, partly by choice and partly in grief, and it had served its purpose, and now it was time to be who I actually was, one more time. And then I rode, with the officers, to my son's house. I want you to picture it because I'll never forget it. Lucas and Sierra's house mid-morning, the two of them inside still writing their imaginary victory. And then the street fills with vehicles. Not two officers in a squad car, a fleet. Federal vehicles, local police, a tactical unit. Neighbors coming to their windows. And the doors opening, and serious men and women in tactical gear and federal jackets moving up to the house with warrants in hand. And me, stepping out of one of the vehicles in my tailored suit, 68 years old, spine straight, no longer anyone's helpless old man. I want to describe that suit for a moment, because it meant something to me that morning that I didn't fully expect. It was a suit from my other life, the director's life, the life of hearings and briefings and command. I hadn't worn it since before my wife died. And when I put it on that morning and looked in the mirror, I saw a man I hadn't seen in years. Not the shrunken, grieving, harmless old retiree I'd let myself become, but Everett Calloway, the man who'd spent 40 years being the last thing financial predators ever wanted to see. The disguise, the slippers, the cardigan, the deliberate forgettableness, slid off, and the real man stood up inside the suit, and I understood that Sierra's great mistake had a poetry to it. By attacking me, she had forced me to become myself again. She'd tried to bury the old man, and instead she'd resurrected the director. And as I stepped out of that federal vehicle in front of my son's house, straightening my jacket, feeling the old straight-spined certainty return to my body after 4 years of grief had bent it, I felt my late wife with me, almost as if she were standing at my shoulder saying, "There you are, Everett. There's the man I married." I wondered when he'd come back. The door opened, and Sierra stood there, and I watched her face as she took in the scene, the fleet, the tactical team, the federal jackets, and I watched her not understand for 1 second, and then begin to understand, and then understand completely. And I watched her eyes find me, standing there in my suit, and I watched the exact moment she realized who I actually was, and what she had actually done, and to whom. And Lucas appeared behind her, and his face, my son's face, just crumpled, because he at least was beginning to grasp the full scale of the catastrophe, and that there was no undoing it. The officers served the warrants. They informed Lucas and Sierra that they were under arrest, for fraud, for identity theft, for forgery, for filing a false police report. They informed them that the relevant assets, all the things they'd stolen and everything downstream of it, had been frozen by court order so that not a dollar could be moved or hidden or spent. Everything they thought they'd won, gone, locked up tight by the law in a single morning. And Sierra, being who she was, tried for a moment to talk her way out of it, to summon the tears, to protest, and it evaporated against the wall of professionals doing their jobs, because tears don't work on an arrest warrant backed by a federal case. And I watched the fight go out of her as the handcuffs went on. The same handcuffs, more or less, that she'd arranged for me the night before. There is a symmetry to justice, sometimes, that no writer could improve upon. I thought, in that moment, about all the times over 40 years I'd watched this exact scene from the other side, the moment the handcuffs close on someone who was utterly certain, right up until that second, that they were too clever to be caught. I'd seen it on the faces of embezzlers and con artists and men who'd stolen the life savings of hundreds of trusting people. That specific expression, the arrogance collapsing into disbelief, collapsing into terror, all in about 3 seconds. I'd seen it hundreds of times. But I'd never once seen it on the face of someone who'd tried to destroy me personally. And I'll be honest, it was different. Not sweeter, I told you. There was no sweetness in any of this for me, but heavier, more final. Because this time the person discovering they weren't as clever as they thought had sat at my table, had married my son, had faked tears in my doorway while strangers put me in chains. Watching Sierra's certainty collapse wasn't a triumph. It was just the closing of a door that never should have had to open. I did not gloat. I want to be clear about that because it matters to me. I did not crow or lecture or throw their cruelty back in their faces. I stood there in my suit, quietly, and I watched the law do its work, and I felt no pleasure in it, only a heavy and complete sense of an ending. Sierra glared at me with pure hatred as they walked her out. Lucas couldn't look at me at all. But I did say one thing to my son. As they led him past me, I stopped them just for a moment, and I looked at Lucas, and I said quietly, so only he could hear, "I would have given you anything, son. Anything you ever needed, you only had to ask. You never had to steal from me, and you certainly never had to try to destroy me." And his face broke completely, and he started to say something, and I just shook my head, because there was nothing he could say, and they led him away. Now, the honest rest of it, because these stories don't really end at the dramatic arrest, and I want to tell you the truth about the aftermath. Sierra is facing very serious charges: the fraud, the identity theft, the forgery, the false report, and more that came out as the investigation deepened, including the truth about the dangerous people she'd entangled herself with. She will be answering for all of it for a very long time. The evidence, much of it gathered by me before she ever thought to move against me, is overwhelming. She built her whole scheme on the belief that her father-in-law was a helpless mark, and that single wrong assumption is what destroyed her. My son Lucas is a more complicated grief. He was complicit. The law had to determine how much, and he is facing real consequences, and he should. But I believe, and the evidence suggested, that Lucas was the weaker partner, led and dominated by Sierra, guilty of terrible weakness and greed, but not the architect of it. That's not innocence. But it's something, and it's the thread I'm holding on to as his father. I have not abandoned my son, I never will. But he has a long road ahead and a great deal to answer for, and I cannot walk it for him. I've gone to see Lucas since. It's not easy, those visits. There's a great deal of silence in them, and a great deal that can't be undone hanging in the air between us. But I go, because I made a promise to his mother long ago that whatever happened I would never stop being his father, and I intend to keep that promise even now, even after everything. On one of those visits, Lucas asked me the question I'd been waiting for, the one that told me there might still be a man worth saving in there. He asked, "Dad, when did you know? About the fraud, when did you figure it out?" And I told him the truth, that I'd known for weeks before that night, that I'd already reported it, that the whole time he thought he was fooling me I'd been building the case, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "So, that night, when we had you arrested, you already knew you'd won?" And I said, "Son, I didn't win anything. There's no winning this. My wife is gone, and my only child is in here, and my daughter-in-law tried to destroy me. Nobody won. I just made sure the right people faced the consequences instead of the wrong one." And for the first time, I saw something like real understanding in my son's face. Not self-pity, but a genuine reckoning with the scale of what he'd thrown away. It's a start, it's only a start, and the road is very long. But I've spent my life believing that people can face what they've done and become something better, and I'm not going to stop believing it about my own son. As for me, I'm still here, in my modest house, though I've stopped hiding who I am quite so completely, because the disguise cost me something I hadn't fully reckoned with. I've come to understand that in trying to be nobody, in hiding my whole self away after my wife died, I made myself more alone, and more of a target than I needed to be. My wife knew who I was and loved me for it. Hiding it from the world was a kind of hiding from my own life. I'm done with that now. I think about her a great deal, my wife. 40-some years together, and she was the only person on earth who knew the whole of me. The cases I couldn't talk about, the weight I carried home, the toll of a life spent staring at the worst of what people do to each other for money. She carried it with me. She'd take one look at me after a hard day and pour 2 glasses and say, "Tell me what you can," and I'd tell her what I could, and somehow the telling made it bearable. When she died, I lost not just my wife, but my witness, the one person who knew who I really was. And I think that's the real reason I disappeared into the harmless old man disguise so completely. It wasn't just operational habit or a wish for peace. It was that the person I'd been myself with was gone, and being that person for anyone else felt impossible, felt like too much, so I just shrank. Became small and quiet and unremarkable, because being fully myself without her to see it felt unbearable. Sierra mistook that grief shrinking for weakness. It wasn't weakness, it was mourning. But I understand how, from the outside, a man folded up small by grief can look like an easy target. That's the cruelest part of what she did. She saw a man hollowed out by loss, and instead of compassion, she saw opportunity. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, and then I'll let you go. My daughter-in-law looked at me and saw a helpless old man, weak, alone, past his prime, an easy mark to be robbed and, when inconvenient, discarded. And she was so certain of what she saw that she never once bothered to find out who I actually was. She built an entire criminal scheme and staked her whole future on an assumption she never checked. And that assumption, that a quiet old man must be a powerless one, is the thing that destroyed her. And that's what I'd want you to take from this, if you take anything. Never assume you know the whole of a person from the small, quiet surface they show the world. The unremarkable old man in the modest house may have spent 40 years doing things you cannot imagine. The person you've written off as harmless, as weak, as past it, as an easy target, you have no idea what's underneath, what they've done, what they're capable of, what they know. Predators fail again and again because they mistake quiet for weak and modest for powerless and old for finished. They are not the same things. The most dangerous person in any room is very often the one who feels no need to tell you so. So let me ask you something, and I do read these. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you were really capable of, written off as harmless or weak or past your prime, and had the quiet satisfaction of proving them wrong? I'd truly like to know, because I've learned there's a real strength in being underestimated, and I suspect many of you have lived it. And here's the one that matters most to me, and I ask it as a father whose own family betrayed him. If you have elderly parents or grandparents or any older person you love, please watch out for them, because financial predators target the isolated and the grieving, and they are counting on no one paying attention. Check in, ask questions, make sure someone is watching. Because the vulnerable are only vulnerable when they're alone, and the simplest protection in the world is a family member who's actually paying attention. Tell me below about an older person in your life you're going to check on, and then go check on them. That's all I've got tonight. If this story gripped you, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you at the next one.